It's a data structure joke, right? So it's about balancing trees. Yeah. Well, yeah. So a heap and the tree is a combined data structure, essentially. Okay. Okay, welcome back. Today we'll be talking about networks. We'll be talking mostly about networks without attributes, and then in the next lecture we'll be talking about probably the rest of this lecture, and then a little bit about networks and attributes, multivariate networks. Today, kind of like, to give us a little bit of context where we are, we talked about tabular data in the last series of lectures. Now I'll be moving on to networks data. And networks are like this very special kind of data, right? Like tabular data tends to be the thing that we see a lot when we get data, right? That's kind of like this spreadsheet. But networks are actually super, super common, but maybe a little bit less common for data analysis. And so networks really model relationships between items, right? We all here are network because we know each other. Just as a kind of like a caveat, I'm going to use the word network and graph interchangeably. But if you want to nitpick, you could say a graph is the generic term, the mathematical definition. It's about graph theory, and networks are a specific instance, right? So we would say a power network. We wouldn't say a power graph, but we would say graph theory, not network theory. Though there's the field of network science, which is kind of like essentially applying graph theory to networks and trying to do actual applications of this all. And I want to kick this off again with challenging you to come up with a little bit of network visualization yourself. So there's like a handout here. This is an exercise. This is a co-author network. And so I've listed a few names here. And then next to the names, there in brackets, you have the number of papers of these people. And then on the right side, you have the links and the attributes. So that's like a common way of getting a network, like the data structure of a network. You get a node list, and then you get a link list, right? And so the left one is here's the node list. The right one here is the link list. And for the links, we also have an attribute. In that case, is the strength of the link, right? And specifically here, how many papers have these two people co-authored? Okay, so we'll take 10 minutes to do this exercise, and then we'll talk about the solutions. Can you pass a couple back here? Yeah. I'll leave you here for latecomers. Okay. I'll leave a few copies here for latecomers. There's some copies at the corner, top left corner.
Right there. Yeah. What's the other? Yeah.
Okay, so how did you all approach this problem? Anybody want to share what they drew as their first design? Yeah. A what? A matrix? A chord, okay. So you had, like, can you explain a little more? Okay, so you basically took that list here and then drew chords on top of it. Okay. So that's a yes. That's definitely an option. Any other ideas? Yeah. Okay, so what I'm hearing here is that this is like a node link diagram where we have the nodes being the people and the size of the node scaled by the number of papers. And then we draw links between the people who co-authored, and we scale those links according to the number of papers, right? And so that would be like a fairly traditional node link layout. The one that you're talking about is actually also a node link layout, but a styled node link layout, right? So you have this straight list. Great, any other ideas? That's a cool idea. So instead of the distance, instead of the width of the line, the distance of the line. That can get tricky though, right? If you, let's suppose, have a triangle or some, like, you can definitely come up with an example where you probably can't do this perfectly. So you have to do some kind of like approximation, but it's fine too. Any other ideas? So yes, you could have the authors twice, have a bipartite graph, and then draw the connections between them and scale them potentially. Another idea for a bipartite graph would be to represent the papers, right? So we could have authors and papers, and then we could, like, that would be a little bit tricky because we have more than like 200 papers here, but it would be possible, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that is a very cool idea. That's basically reframing the network problem as a set problem, because in the end, really, networks and sets are super related, right? We'll actually talk about hypergraphs, which are even more related to sets. So that is a cool idea, like a set-based layout for like a Euler diagram layout for this problem. Yeah.
And then like a number line that shows like how many.
Nice. Yeah, that would definitely be, especially if you have an interactive system, that would be like a cool thing that you could pick a focus author, right, and then show the relationships to all the other people. Anybody tried a tabular layout? No. Okay. Well. You can, this is the traditional one, right? Like I did, like, this was PowerPoint or Keynote quality visualization that I did here. So I didn't really do any fancy scaling here. I just drew the network and then I visualized the attributes on top of here. So this is kind of like, I think, what everybody thinks of if we talk about network visualization, right? The node link visualization. This one here is what I was trying to hint at, right? That's what's called an adjacency matrix, right? So what you do here is you put the same people here in the row columns and in the rows, and then you fill in the cell whenever there's an edge between them, right? That's kind of like the second large type of network visualizations. And so we'll be introducing these piece by piece in the lecture today. Oh, and of course, in the cells here, you can list, like, you can kind of like record how many shared papers they have, and of course you could color code the cells, right, and so on. Great. So networks are these super fundamental data structures, and without networks, or graphs, we wouldn't have any of those. We wouldn't have the web, right? The web, the internet is just like one big network. We wouldn't have Google, because Google is all about networks and network algorithms, right? Like everybody, I'm sure, has heard the story of Google, how they invented PageRank as a way to surface the best websites. We wouldn't have navigation, because streets are networks, right? Like streets connect places, and when we want to navigate between different places, what we actually want to do is a shortest path search. And the shortest path search might use different criteria, right? It might use speed, it might use distance, it might use kind of like some priority of the road, and so on. And so whenever you pull out your phone to navigate somewhere, you're actually doing like a network operation, right? Every computer, every phone that you're using here, it's all integrated circuits, right? And circuits is just another word for networks. And so like this is, electronics are all made up of networks. And then of course, everybody's talking about Twitter these days. Twitter, Facebook, Mastodon, and so on are these social networks, right? That's maybe what you think about network visualization. you frequently see network visualizations for these kinds of social networks. So this is like a Facebook graph, like how Facebook users are connected. Anything that's notable about this network here, if you look at it? Well, it's also a map visualization, so you could sort of apply some of the lessons from the map lecture from last time from Tuesday here. Yeah. Well, you know, the thing is that Canadian population really lives along the US border, right? They don't go up north much. But what you also see is nobody in China uses Facebook, right? But you know, what we can see here is actually not so much of the network structure, right? We mostly see geolocations, and then there are some edges that make it look fancy, but it's not actually a good network visualization. The other domain where we study networks frequently is in biology, right? So interactions between genes and proteins and chemical products can be modeled as networks. The brain, the way we think, is all one big, massive, extremely complicated network, right? We have connections between neurons that kind of like make us think, make us remember, and so on. Everybody here has a network of family, right? Like you descend from some people, so you have the whole, like a whole ancestry is like your lineage, a network that describes how you're related to people that lived long before you were born. And similarly, in a more extreme way, phylogeny, how are species related, right? That is kind of like the tree of life. How are we related to fungi versus plants, or how are we related to the snakes and so on, right? That is also kind of captured in networks. And of course, these networks at this scale, especially brain and phylogeny and so on, right? Fundamentally, they are networks, but we don't know the structure of the network, right? And so questions, for example, that researchers who want to study brain networks want to answer is this, like, what are the types of connectivity, right? Is there a difference between the types of connectivity if the brain is diseased, for example, if you have Alzheimer and so on? So there's plenty of super interesting questions to ask here. This here is a metabolic network. This is actually, when I started my PhD, we got this wallpaper poster, like my PhD was a lot on networks, and so we got this wallpaper poster size poster in our office. And that here shows you kind of like the chemical reaction that are going on when in a human metabolism, right? And this map here would have like a little leaflet handbook with it. And then you could look up a particular chemical compound and it would give you E6, and then you could go there and try to identify what's going on in the particular process. And this is really just, and this is knowledge state of the year 2000. We know much, much more about this, of course, now, right? So this is just to illustrate how complicated networks are, especially biological networks. And so there's lots of work to be done for visualization research. And then here is like a short TED video. I'll play the first few minutes that talks about the importance of social networks. And I mean by that, not like actual social networks, not digital social networks.
10 years, I've been spending my time trying to figure out how and why human beings assemble themselves into social networks. The kind of social network I'm talking about is not the recent online variety, but rather the kind of social network that human beings have been assembling for hundreds of thousands of years, ever since we emerged from the African savannah. So I formed friendships and co-worker and sibling and relative relationships with other people who in turn have similar relationships with other people. This spreads on out endlessly into existence, and you get a network that looks like this. Every dot is a person, every line between them is a relationship between two people, different kinds of relationships. And you can get this kind of vast fabric of humanity in which we're all embedded. My colleague James Fowler and I have been studying for quite some time what are the mathematical, social, biological, and psychological rules that govern how these networks are assembled. And what are the similar rules that govern how they operate, how they affect our lives? But recently, we've been wondering whether it might be possible to take advantage of this insight, to actually find ways to improve the world, to do something better, to actually fix things, not just understand things. So one of the first things we thought we would tackle would be how we go about predicting epidemics. The current state of the art in predicting an epidemic through the CDC or some other national body is to sit in the middle where you are and collect data from physicians and laboratories in the field that report the prevalence or the incidence of certain conditions. So patients in diagnosed with something or other patients been diagnosed. And all these data are fed into a central repository with some delay. And if everything goes smoothly, 1 to 2 weeks from now, you'll know where the epidemic was today. And actually, about a year or so ago, there was this sort of promulgation of this notion of Google flu threat with respect to the flu, where by looking at people's search behavior today, you can know where the flu, what the status of the epidemic was today, what's the prevalence of the epidemic today. But what I'd like to show you today is the means by which we might get not just rapid warning about an epidemic, but also actually early detection of an epidemic. And in fact, this idea can be used not just to predict epidemic germs, but also to predict epidemics of all sorts of kinds. For example, anything that's spread by a form of social contagion could be understood in this way. From abstract ideas on the left, like patriotism or altruism or religion, to practices like dieting behavior or book purchasing or drinking or bicycle helmet, other safety practices, or products that people might buy, purchase an electronic good. Anything in which there's kind of an interpersonal spread, kind of a diffusion of innovation, could be understood and predicted by the mechanism I'm going to show you now. So as all of you probably know, the classic way of thinking about this is the diffusion of innovation or the adoption curve. So here on the y-axis, we have the percent of the people that are affected. On the x-axis, we have time. In the very beginning, not too many people are affected, and you get this classic sigmoidal or S-shaped curve. And the reason for this shape is that at the very beginning, let's say 1 or 2 people are affected by this, and then they affect or infect 2 people, who in turn affect 4, 8, 6, and so forth, and you get the epidemic growth phase of the curve. And then eventually you saturate the population of fewer and fewer people who are still available that you might infect, and then you get the plateau of the curve, you get this classic sigmoidal curve. And this holds for germs, ideas, product adoption, behaviors, and the like. But things don't just diffuse in human populations at random, they actually diffuse through networks. Because as I said, we live our lives in networks. And these networks have a particular kind of structure. Now, if you look at a network like this is 105 people, and the lines represent the dots of the people, and the lines represent friendship relations. You might see that people occupy different locations within the network. And there are different kinds of relationships between the people. You have friendship relationships, sibling relationships, spousal relationships, co-worker relationships, neighbor relationships, and the like. And different sorts of things spread across different sorts of ties. For instance, sexually transmitted diseases will spread across sexual ties. Or, for instance, people's smoking behavior might be influenced by their friends, or their altruistic or their charitable giving behavior might be influenced by their coworkers or by their neighbors. But not all divisions in the network are the same. So if you look at this, you might immediately grasp that different people have different numbers of connections. Some people have 1 connection, some have 2, some have 6, some have 10 connections. And this is called the degree of a node, or the number of connections that a node has. But in addition, there's something else. So if you look at nodes A and B, they both have 6 connections. But if you can see this image from a bird's eye view, you can appreciate that there's something very different in nodes A and B. So let me ask you this. I can cultivate this situation by asking a question. Who would you rather see if the deadly germ was spreading through the network? A or B? B. It's obvious. B is located on the edge of the network.
Okay, I guess you get the idea. I'm not sure how successful we are nowadays of applying predictive modeling for pandemics, given what we've experienced since that. But in theory, it's possible. I guess our ability to mount intervention is still lacking, right? But yeah, so he comes to like a lot of important points here. Network structure really influences everything about the network, and so that's why we need to talk first a little bit about graph theory fundamentals. So network science or graph theory goes back to Euler, and Euler, there was like this popular problem back then in his circles that's called the Königsberg Bridge problem, and that is kind of like the city of Königsberg back in Euler's time here, shown on a map, and there is kind of like an island in the center of the city, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bridges that lead or that cross these rivers of these different land masses, including in the island, right? And so the question that people asked back then is, can you take a stroll over all the bridges, visiting all the land masses without crossing a single bridge twice? I'll give you a second to think about this. Anybody want to give an answer? I guess it would be boring if the answer were yes, right? So the answer is no, you cannot do it. And Euler thought about this a little bit, right? Like you can, of course, empirically test this for this particular case. Can you find the counterexample? But he kind of, well, one observation he immediately made, the path that you take once you're on land is completely irrelevant, right? So you can kind of treat all of these land masses as nodes. And then the thing that really matters are how are these nodes connected. And these nodes are connected via the bridges, which are the edges, right? And that's kind of the birth of graph theory. And a very related problem, or actually the only possible graph with at most two nodes, so the Euler essentially kind of like by this abstraction, he realized this is kind of like our network here. As I said, the land masses don't matter, and he could actually show that it wouldn't be possible, that it's not possible. It would only be possible with a graph with at most two nodes with an odd number of links. But this graph has 4 nodes with odd number of links, right? And so that is kind of the problem here. This is kind of the related concept here is a Hamiltonian path. For example, a path that visits each vertex exactly once. So let's talk a little bit about more formally about terms for graphs. And so we call a graph that consists a data structure that consists of a set of vertices. We call these vertices or nodes, and a set of edges, which we often also call links connecting these vertices. And so vertices and nodes are like, you can treat them interchangeably, and edges and links, you can treat them interchangeably. And then we have simple graphs and non-simple graphs. A simple graph is a graph that contains no multi-edges and no loops. So by loops, I mean self-loops. So here, the orange pieces here would be either multi-edges, where you see these 2 connections here that connect for 2 nodes twice, and the loop is kind of like a self-connection, right? In some graphs, it makes a lot of sense to have these loops and to have these multi-edges, but this is not a simple graph. This would be a general graph. And then for edges, we also distinguish directionality. Edges can be directed or they can be undirected. And so if they're directed, we consider like if there's an A directed edge to B, we consider A connected to B, but B not to A. Think of this as one-way streets, right? A hypergraph is a graph where a single edge connects any number of vertices. This is kind of something that takes a little bit to think about, especially if you think about this in this node and link term. But really, like it could be possible that one simple edge connects all of the sets, right? And a good example is all of you here are, for example, in this class. And so that's like one big connection that you all share. So being a student in this class is kind of like your hyper edge. And so the way to think about this is also useful to think of it as sets, right? An independent set is kind of like the boring case where you have only nodes but no edges. And a clique is exactly the opposite. A clique contains all possible edges, right? And that's why we say like this is like the clique in friendship is kind of the principle, because all people know each other. Unconnected graphs are graphs that are broken up into several pieces where you cannot from any vertex traverse via edges to any other vertex. And then articulation point is this red dot here, is this special node that if I were to remove that node, then the graph would break up. And of course, something like this is very important when you think about resilience in networks, right? If you have a power network, you do not want to have an articulation point like this, right? If there's like one power plant or one kind of like transformation center where everything in Salt Lake City go through, then like that one thing breaks and everybody is without power. And so studying these articulation points is important. Then we have biconnected graphs. This is a kind of a definition for graphs that are resilient, that are without an articulation point. And bipartite graphs that we already talked about a little bit, where we can partition the node set into 2 disjunct sets, right? And so a simple example would be our paper co-author one. We have, like set 1 are people, set 2 are papers, right? And they are connected by co-authorship but they're not directly connected, right? The papers, of course, papers cite each other and people are connected, but if we just look at co-authorship, this would be a bipartite graph so there are connections between the two sets, but not within the two sets. And a bipartite graph can be rendered like this, but it can also just be, I can also just show different types of nodes. And then a very special type of network is a tree. Trees are like, super useful in many different applications, including data structures. The definition of a tree is like the kind of like the most generous definition is a tree with no cycles. But typically, this is a tree here, but this tree here doesn't have a root. And typically, I tend to think of a tree as a rooted tree, right? So roots are very common in trees, and they're often very useful. And you can also have like a recursive definition. A tree is a collection of nodes that contains a root node and then 0 to n subtrees. And the subtrees are connected to root by an edge. And so here, like, this is our overall tree, and then the root has like 4 or n subtrees in this case here. And so trees are a very special data structure, also very special for visualization because they are, they're much more restricted. And so we actually can choose different layouts for them than we can do for general graphs. And for trees, we sometimes also distinguish between ordered trees or unordered trees, right? So if we consider a tree to be ordered, then those two trees here would be different because I've swapped these two nodes here in their order. And I could go on and talk about different types of networks, and there's actually books that describe graph classes and so on. But I guess I've listed the most important one. But if you're interested, you can take a look at a survey like this here. So we can always visualize a graph, but like we do with tables, we can look at summary statistics about tabular data in a histogram or in a kernel density estimate. We can also do that with a network, right? And the most important metric that was also mentioned in this video here is the node degree. And so node degree is very simply the number of edges connecting a node. And so, like, in this case here, node 2 here has a degree of 3 because there's 1, 2, 3 edges going out of it, right? But node 1 here has a degree of 1 because there's only 1 edge going out of it. And node 3 and 4 both have a degree of 2. For directed graphs, we measure in and out degrees separately. We can calculate the average degree fairly easily. And then what we can do is we can plot the degree distribution. And here are 2 examples of trees, like this structure here. That's kind of exactly this. We have 2 nodes with degree 2. That's like the 4 and 3. Then we have 1 node with degree 1 and 1 node with degree 3, right? So that's kind of like in this case, this is expressed here as the percentage of total degree, but it's the same principle. But I could also construct a network like this ring here, where each node has exactly the same degree. So looking at degree distributions of a real network, what we typically see in many networks, these are called scale-free networks, is this kind of like asymptotic relationship that most nodes have a very low degree. Very quickly does the degree distribution drop. And then we have a few nodes that are very central to the network, right? So that's kind of like a thing that we observe in many natural networks and social networks and so on. So because we have these principles of kind of like preferential attachments and people that are very connected in the tree are more likely to form new connections and so on. And so we can measure degree and we can plot degree. Here I'm showing you one of the classical examples for network visualization and for graph theory is this network of Les Miserables characters. I've showed this before in the D3 network lecture. These are characters from Les Mis. We have Valjean, who is kind of the main character. He's not surprisingly here in the center of the network. And then we have other characters around him, and they're connected if they mentioned essentially in the same page or on the same or interact in this story. I don't exactly remember what it was. But this is kind of like a nice network because it's simple, it's small, it lays out nicely. So that's kind of like a good example to use to explain the principles of trees. And so here I'm plotting the degree as the size of the node. And what we see here is the degree is a measure of local importance. And this is also what the video was getting at, right? So those 2 nodes that he showed had the same degree, but they had a different measure of global importance. But here, for example, If we take out Muriel, we would lose all of those different people, but it wouldn't affect the paths that go through Valjean. So degree, a measure of local importance. So the next thing we need to talk about is path and distances. And so paths are super common in whenever you have like a network problem, you wanted to think about path. And the path is a route along links. The path length is the number of links contained. So two nodes are connected by a path of length. If they're connected by a path of length 1. And the very common problem is to find shortest path that connects nodes I and j. And so we can use many different algorithms for this. Like, for example, if it's an unweighted graph, we can do something like a breadth first search. But if it's a weighted graph, we would use something like a Dijkstra's algorithm, right? And I'm sure you've heard about this in a data structure class. A metric that we sometimes also use is the diameter of a graph. This is the longest, shortest path within G. Okay, and so we can then use path to get a global measure of importance. And like a very useful measure of importance is the betweenness centrality. And the principle of the betweenness centrality is how many shortest paths do go through a particular node, right? So if you have, for example, if you want to look for the shortest path from, let's say, Isbo to Grivier, you would go to Valjean, right? And so basically everybody from here to here needs to more or less go through Valjean, right? And so if we count all the possible shortest path between all pairs of nodes, and then we count for each node how many of the shortest paths go through that node, that's our measure for betweenness centrality. And betweenness centrality is a very good measure for overall importance, overall relevance of a node in a graph, right? And so if we compare the betweenness centrality and the degree, we can see that typically in a network like this, we see that the betweenness centrality actually like tapers off even quicker, right? So there's very few nodes that are super important in the network, but many other nodes that are not so important. Whereas in the histogram of degrees, we have a little bit more of kind of like, there's a few nodes that have a degree of 25, for example. Okay, so that was kind of a very quick introduction into graph theory. And now I want to talk about network and tree visualization. And so as we had when we talked about tabular data, we talked about these different tasks. We talked about, do you want to like judge the magnitude or see proportions or see correlations, right? So these were kind of the tasks. And the same, of course, is important for tree or network visualization. We want to kind of like, there's different questions that we might want to ask, and that's going to really influence what we are choosing in terms of our graphical representation. And similarly, the type of data we have is going to influence our graphical representation. So the tasks are kind of like, there's this short paper that has been very, very influential here that lists all of these different tasks. This is by Bongxin Li and others. And so they essentially come up with two principal types of tasks. The two principal types here are attribute-based tasks and topology-based tasks. And so attribute-based tasks are those that are concerned with node attributes, right? For example, like who is the oldest person in your node in your social network, or who has kind of like an attribute could also be the degree, right? So who has the most friends? That would be an attribute-based task. And the topology-based task would be anything that's concerned about the connectivity, the topology of the network, right? So pathfinding is a topology-based task. And then they divide this up into localize, find neighboring nodes, identify cluster communities, and find path. And so like for localize, this is about finding a single or multiple nodes or edges with a property. An example for an attribute-based task would be to find the edges with the maximum edge weight. And the example for a topology-based task would be find all adjacent nodes of a given node. Okay, so, and then we have three fundamental types of graph representation, and we kind of already like came up with those two here, right? The node link diagram and then the adjacency matrix. And then we have a third one that is specific for trees, the implicit layout. And so we'll talk about all of these. So explicit graph representations, as I already said, are the most familiar ones. We have these node link diagrams where the vertex is a point or some kind of other shaped mark, and the edge is a line or an arc. And so the problem really with these layouts is how do we like place the nodes, right? And how do we draw the edges? And so there's a few different types of layouts, but generally we can kind of classify them into 3 layouts where all I care about is the topology. So I can kind of like adjust the layout of my network such that I can like clearly see the topology. There would be a styled layout. This is kind of like the example that you had earlier with like the list and the edges between them, right? Because the list was given, and so you just drew the edges between them. And so the styled layout could be on a list, it could be on a grid, it could be on a circle, or anything like that, right? So here you don't have to worry about, once you picked your style, you don't have to worry about how to place the nodes. You have to worry about how can you still like make the edges visible. And then the Facebook graph was an example of a fixed layout, right? Where the nodes were given. They were in a specific location. This often happens if you have some, like, a map or some other geospatial context. And then you want to draw the edges on top of it. So we can like actually come up with criteria for what makes a node link layout good. And so we can say that we want to minimize the edge crossing. We want to minimize distances of neighboring nodes, right? I don't want to have 2 neighbors that are completely on the opposite ends of a graph. We want to minimize our drawing area. We want to make the edges to be about the same size always. We want to avoid bended edges or minimize the edge bends. We want to maximize angular distance between connections. We want an aspect ratio, like height by width, of about 1. It shouldn't be like a super wide or super tall network. And we want symmetry. So, for example, if I have a certain structure in a network and that structure reappears in different places of the network, I want to see it in these different places to also look the same, right? So if I have a connected click of 5 people, I want to see that 5 people in that nice pattern on different places. But unfortunately, these criteria are conflicting, right? So I can, for example, draw this simple network here without any edge crossings, but it's not a great layout, right? Because we are violating the uniform edge length principle. And so here, I could instead draw it like this, the same network here, draw it like this, but then I have an edge crossing, right? And in this case, probably the one with edge crossing is nicer. And so you kind of like, you have to define what you think is a good layout. And then you can optimize for that particular problem. Or, and then the other thing we said, we want space utilization. So for example, here in this case, in this tree layout, we could kind of say, okay, we have space here to spread out these nodes, but then we want symmetry, like 1 node with 3 children should always look the same, right? And so these are different conflicting criteria for that layout too. And so when we want to create these layouts, we can really actually write this down as a mathematical optimization problem. We can say, we can convert the layout criteria into a weighted cost function f here, where we have some weight, like a, then the number of edge crossings is the first criteria. And then we have our parameter, like our weight f, and then have the used drawing space here, right? So we could in theory go in and specify my network should have these properties, and then we could use a standard optimization technique to minimize that function, and that would be our layout, right? So we could use something like simulated annealing to find a layout that minimizes the cost function. And this is like actually how like a lot of network layout works. So that is kind of a very common thing to do that. Another very common network layout are force-directed layout. And this is kind of like this abstract physics model, right? The idea that edges act like springs that connect 2 nodes, and the vertices or nodes, they act like repulsive magnets, right? So they push each other away when they get too close to each other, but the springs pull them together. And typically the vertices, like the magnetic force is much weaker than the spring force, because you want, like, it strictly has to be weaker, but it's usually much weaker, because otherwise you would just always like extend the spring further into infinity, right? And so this is also what like the D3 force layout uses. And let's see, here's like our live example, right, that we've seen before. And what you can already see is we start with some random initialization here, and then this iterates a couple of times, and then we reach a stable state, as you can see it here. So how does this work? First, we start off by placing vertices in random location. And then we have a loop, and we say, while not in equilibrium, and you can measure equilibrium by how much nodes were moved in total, right? So I would probably have some kind of lower bound measure here. Calculate the force on the vertex, on each vertex. And the force here is the sum of all pairwise repulsion of all nodes, right? So I take every node and calculate, I have my repelling force to everything else. Distance plays a role here. And I calculate for every node what is the sum of its repelling forces, the sum in the direction. And then you have a vector in the end, and that kind of like moves that node in the direction of that vector. And then the opposing force, of course, would be the attraction between the connected nodes. As I mentioned, this is going to be stronger, right? And so this here is what is expensive about this layout algorithm, right? Because a pairwise calculation of all repulsive forces is very expensive. And this term here really scales with the number of edges, right? So if I have a very sparsely connected graph, then this is barely going to matter. If I have a completely connected graph, this is going to be exactly the same, asymptotically speaking, as for the previous term. And then I would move my vertex by a constant multiplied by the force on that vertex, have a new position, and then I start a new cycle, right? And I keep doing this, keep doing this, keep doing this until I reach a state where things don't move all that much anymore. And so anybody has a guess on the complexity, algorithmic complexity of this? Constant. If I have an n by n term. No. It's not factorial, fortunately. It's cubic, right? So we have an n by n term in here. And in practice, it takes about n iterations to reach a stable layout, right? So we have a n to the power of 3, roughly asymptotic complexity. And so, yeah, you've seen this. Here is just another video of this again, how this works. And of course, on a modern computer for a small network like this is extremely fast. What happens if we have no links, right? Or if the link strengths would be weaker than the repulsive strength? Then we would just have nodes drifting apart forever. And so what are the properties of this force-directed layout? Generally, this creates fairly decent layouts, especially for like smallish graphs that are not extremely dense. It also kind of enforces uniform edge length pretty well. Clusters are often pretty well visible. One thing, because we do some random initialization, right, it's not a deterministic layout. So you can actually not expect that if you run this algorithm twice, you will not get the same result. It still looks roughly the same, right? Like, for example, if I go back here. If I go back here and reload, it's going to look more or less the same, right? Because I guess maybe it's not completely random, the initialization. I guess it's, yeah, I'm assuming it's random, but pseudo-random, not actually random here, right? But if it were actually random, it wouldn't be the same. Okay, so you've already seen my nice cat picture here. But first, like I already talked about the computational complexity. So basically, like a rule of thumb is on a computer, on a modern computer, you can run like an interactive force-directed layout with about 1,000 nodes. In practice, you also need to implement things like damping or center of gravity, right? You want to keep your network on the screen, and you also have other attributes, as you saw when you when we looked at the D3 network layout. For example, we want to make sure that nodes don't overlap, which isn't guaranteed by default in this algorithm, right? So we would have like an additional parameter in this algorithm. So the problem is that node link layouts and also force-directed layouts specifically tend to become these gigantic hairballs. And so these figures here, they have the purpose of showing something is complex. I call them shock and awe figures, right? But we call them giant hairballs and because they remind us of giant hairballs, right? And so, yeah, so you have to be a little bit careful about which layouts you choose and what you actually visualize in network visualization. So if you want to lay out a very large graph, this computational complexity becomes a burden, right? And so one thing that you could do is you could first run a clustering algorithm on your network, and then you would have, let's say, 200 clusters on your network. And then you would, instead of calculating the pairwise repulsion between all nodes, you would only calculate the pairwise repulsion between the nodes in that cluster and global pairwise repulsion between the clusters, right? So that really reduces the complexity of the algorithm quite a bit. And so you have these, you basically, you calculate it within a cluster, and then you calculate it again for these meta nodes that represent these clusters. So that's kind of like an idea of how to make this faster. Quite an alternative approach, and like basically, whenever you do these node link diagrams that look like these massive hairballs, if you want to show my graph is big, go for it, right? But if you want to show like some specific connection, then you need to do something different. And so I think that a lot of network tasks are actually about specific connections, right? Like we don't actually interact with the social network by looking at the whole of Facebook, the whole for Facebook network, but we care about what are our connections doing, right? Or what is a specific connection doing. And so an overview isn't always helpful. And so we tried this. Here we have like another co-author network with, I think it was 20,000 papers and something like 2,000 nodes. And so I can search for a node in here. And add this node and its neighbors to the tree. And so what we're doing here, this is like a bipartite graph. These are like people, Mariah Meyer, and then we have papers that she's written. And then we can expand this, and we can see who are the co-authors in that particular paper. And we can keep expanding this and see on these other papers who are the co-authors, right? And so the one thing that we are we kind of like, you know, you query a network in the backend. This is actually uses a graph database. So we query a network, retrieve a node, and then retrieve its neighbors, and then we fill in more information about these neighbors as we go, right? We can kind of dynamically expand our search. And here we also use a tree layout for the network, and we then kind of like add these links back in later. So this here, let's see, to hover at the same time. So this here means this person here, he also worked with her on this one paper, but he also worked with her on these other papers, right? So that kind of like brings in back that structure that we lost when we did this as a tree. Yeah. It's a recreation, yes, and it's. I would say it doesn't have a ton in common except for the basic layout ideas. Yeah. So this is, we'll talk a little bit more about this stuff next lecture, because I kind of wanted to ignore this for now. But this is like a attribute visualization for these node elements. And then here, this is actually a little bit of, this is actually an adjacency matrix, which we'll be talking about later. But yeah, for now, let's just talk about, you know, the principle here is, even if I have a network with 20,000 nodes, I can like search for individual things based on some criteria and expand from there, right? A really cool layout is this here. And so like one thing that like anybody who, like, you've seen this metabolic network that I showed at the beginning where I talked about this paper poster. And so these orthogonal layouts here are fairly common in biological graphics, right? They kind of like make it easy to trace. But these are typically created by hand, right? So people actually sit down and create these layouts. They publish them in textbooks. And this paper here, the HOLA paper, HOLA stands for human-like orthogonal layout. They did this really cool approach of taking a human layout, a human-generated layout. Here in the middle is what you see, what the best case algorithmically generated layout was before then. And then they created an algorithm inspired by the human layout that produces this. And so why I have this in here is because I just love their approach, right? So they did give these kind of like initial examples to people, to like a crowd of people online, and ask them to generate the best possible layout. Okay, to kind of manually generate the best possible layout. And then they ask another set of people to rank the layouts. What is the best layout versus what is the worst layout, right? So you can see this participant here actually didn't do much work, right? They just wanted to complete this task quickly. Whereas this human here has really thought about, these two guys here have really thought about what is it that makes this transparent, right? And so they analyzed these human layouts, and then they recreated an algorithm that uses the criteria that they found in these human layouts. And so I just really like that approach, right? Of like giving it to people, try to make it best, and then also giving it again to people and try to rank it, and then using these ranked lists to create the best possible layout from it. Back when I really worked a lot on networks, people wrote me a lot of email about, oh, I have an VR glasses and I want to solve the problem of network visualization with my VR glasses, right? Or AR. And you know, we've talked about 3D. What do you think? Is this here a good representation? Is this a good idea? Yeah, but you know, is it better than what you can do on a computer screen? So, you know, so first question is why AR, right? Why do I need to see my office furniture while I'm analyzing the network, right? So basically AR is awesome if you have some spatial context, but if you want some just like 3D spatial depth perception and so on, everything included, go for VR, right? Not for AR. And why is VR maybe not the best solution either? Exactly, and it just gets really tricky to interact with it, right? You have to do all of these kinds of rotations all the time. You have all of the problems that we have with 3D, with occlusion and so on. The other, I guess, a more fundamental problem is in 2D, I know exactly how the person is looking onto the network, right? So I can create a layout that optimizes for this one perspective. In 3D, if I rotate, I can't do that, right? So I have a lot of occlusion between nodes that I can completely avoid, for example, on a computer screen. So for network visualizations, really, there isn't really a good use case for 3D. Okay, so the second class here would be the styled or restricted layouts. So for example, a circular layout, I could just arrange all of my nodes along a circle, and then I can draw all of the edges between it. This here are 300 edges, and which is like 3% of all possible edges. Here we have 600 edges, about 6.3% of all possible edges. So we can see that this gets pretty cluttered pretty fast, right? So that's kind of like one of the big problems about fixed layouts is that we have a lot of clutter from the nodes. However, we can do something smart about this. We can do edge bundling. And so edge bundling, it works in, well, whenever I have a little bit more information about the structure of a network, I can use edge bundling. And so here, this is a call graph from software. So what you see here on the outer rings are software packages. And then here we have files. And then in here, we have functions, right? And these functions, they call, for example, here or get called from here. And then here, this function calls over here. And these functions here tend to call within this and so on. But we have kind of like a little bit more information than just the pure call graph. We have the hierarchical structure of the source code repository here as well, right? And I guess it would be fair to assume that maybe code tends to not randomly call other code all over a software project, right? It might call like one central piece a lot, but it might also call its immediate neighbors a lot, right? And so we can leverage this structure to bundle our edges here. And so this is what this here does, right? So this kind of gives us big highways, big routes, and we see exactly those two effects that I talked about, right? So we have these within package calling, and then we have like these very central pieces of the code here that are just frequently interacting with other pieces of the code. So how does this work? It's basically what's going on is you take this ring of the laid out nodes, and then I have I draw my hierarchy inside it again. So here, just the inner ring here is the original ring. And then I flip the hierarchy that I had, and I can draw it as a node link diagram. So for example, this here would be the function calls, and this node here would be a file. And then here, this would be the folder, right? So we have this kind of like hierarchy now within the ring. And then instead of connecting this edge from here to here directly, we instead route that edge along with a spline along the path of that hierarchy, right? that's the principle of how that algorithm works. And of course, I can kind of adjust how snugly that spline here adheres to our tree topology, right? So if it perfectly aligns with the tree topology, we will kind of like, not see all that much, because all we will see is exactly that kind of network here. But if we relax it a little bit, we see these patterns. And so here are different examples of this bundling strength beta. So beta 0 is kind of our original one. And if we beta is 1, then we basically get this layout here. But in between, we get these nice bundled structures here. So you can dynamically play with beta if you want to, like in D3, you can do that. You can like create a slider and you can adjust the bundling strength, and you can see that. So that's a very cool idea, and it was a super popular paper. The thing about this kind of approach is that you have to have this hierarchical structure in the back, right? And not every network does have that. And so people have thought about how can we do this bundling also in general networks. And so what they came up with is that we could actually treat a line segment as a network itself, right? So we can break up a line segment, an edge, into, let's say we have an edge of this length, and we break it up into 10 pieces. And then we can simulate, like, then we can, each line segment can attract all of the other ones too, right? So we can do another force simulation for each of the line segments. And then kind of like line segments that are close to each other tend to get closer to each other. And that's the principle of a layered algorithm like this here. This is extremely computationally expensive, right? Because suddenly you break up the line, the edges into segments, and you have to do force layouts on top of them. And it's also like slightly questionable how useful this is, right? I think that the hierarchical example was really good, but between those two examples, like, yeah, maybe this looks cleaner, right? But I don't know whether analytically it's better. It's hard. Like, if people have studied this, and I think the literature essentially says, well, maybe for some cases, but not for others, right? And so overall, given how expensive and how hard this is to do, it's probably not worth it. A super important concept if you want to deal with large networks are supernodes or aggregation, right? So sometimes you can aggregate many different nodes into one supernode that can stand in for all of the other nodes. You could either do this by category. So for example, if we wanted to study how like the CS department interacts with other departments, we could kind of group all of the people that are in the CS department into one supernode, take all of their connections to the biomedical informatics department and aggregate the biomedical informatics department. Then we have two nodes, and then we have all of the connections in one big connection between them, right? And so you can do this manually or by categorical, like I just explained, or you can also do clustering. So you can automatically group these nodes and then essentially abstract them away into a structure of supernodes. And here, I want to show this video in a second, but this essentially takes this, this idea of aggregation and creating supernodes. And what this does here is we have a network of how people move across the continent or across the United States. We're only showing the connections between regions where there is like this rectangular brush here. So this is kind of like what this here on the left shows. So this is kind of like movement from the Pacific Northwest to Southern California and to the Northeast and to Florida, right? So we see these kinds of like movement patterns here, but actually what you can do is you can abstract this away. You can like count all of these nodes and these edges in here, and you can count all of the nodes in here. And you can say, well, actually the movement between Washington and Arizona and Washington isn't all that big. There's many, many more people that are moving within Washington, right? That's what this arrow here shows you, the thick 717 arrow. And then we see that a lot of people move from New York to Florida, and a lot of people move within Florida and so on, right? So by kind of like making this, adding this abstraction layer, we can simplify an extremely complicated graph here with many, many, many thousands of nodes and edges to something super simple, where we can then also show attributes that we do here. Like, for example, the distribution in Montana, some distribution or some scatterplot in Washington, or some tree map in Florida. So we can do all of this. This is one of my favorite network papers out there. Maybe I'll skip the video in the interest of time because I've already explained it in some detail, but the video is nice. They show you how to dynamically generate this. So if we reflect a little bit on explicit representation, we have certain pros. So first, we are able to depict all different graph classes. So is it is it bipartite? Is it completely connected? Is it a tree? All of this can be visualized with like node-link layouts. It can be customized by weighing the layout constraints, and it's actually pretty good for topology-based tasks, right? If you want to do path finding, and have a good layout, you can do it kind of by hand, and it's not all that hard. The cons are it's computing an optimal graph layout is NP hard, but also just even achieving minimal edge crossing is in NP hard. And the heuristic algorithms that we talked about, like an optimization algorithm or Spring Embedder, are still computationally expensive, and it has the tendency to clutter. And so you get these giant hairballs. And so now I want to do a design critique. And the design critique here is an interactive system. So while I hand out this and you have a computer out, it's useful if you have at least one of you in your group has a computer out. Go to china.fathom.info, and I'll pass the handout around. This is a network visualization, and we'll ask some questions about it later. Yeah. Yeah, you can look at all of them. Yeah. Sure. Whatever you haven't used yet, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know what. Why different? No, I think it's.
Okay, so we don't have a ton of time left, so let's maybe start a discussion about this. A little bit of context. This is maybe, I have no hard data on this, but it feels to me it's probably the most complex visualization ever published by a news outlet. This was on a Reuters page for quite a bit, and it was developed by Fathom, which is like a small kind of viz consultancy in Boston. And we've actually, Ben Fry, who runs the company, I've seen some of the examples of his already in this class. So we have a few different visualizations here. I'm going to skip over to China 1-on-1. Let's look first at the social power one here. Okay, so what's going on here? What are our nodes? People, yes. Anybody see another node type? I couldn't hear you. Status. Yeah, so status, or kind of like, you know, who, like maybe like a categorical property, right? And these are the big nodes. And how do we know who is a princeling and who is a leader? Proximity, yeah. So when we loaded this, we already saw that there's some force-directed thing going on, right? So we click on this, they originate somewhere, they move over. So there's some simulation going on. And then we have also in the middle here we have some key characters, right, that seem to be connected to a lot of different people. So another thing that is across this whole visualization isn't happening is they use interaction a lot, right? So what are they using interaction for here? Yeah, exactly. But like, let's talk about hover first. Exactly. So they are not showing us all of the edges by default, right? And why do you think that is? Exactly. It's an attempt that they make to clean up this whole layout, right? Otherwise, it would be maybe possibly too difficult to read, right? So we can, like if I hover over the people, you see these connections appear. And we also have tooltips that explain who this person is, right? And how they are connected. Okay. So then I guess we can also switch between different layout types, right? So they have essentially, these are categorical dimensions of that network. And we can switch this to, is it like, are these kingmakers, rising stars, or the 7, or what are the coalitions, or power, the family power here that we see. So we can kind of like, rearrange the layout. And that is actually kind of, we'll talk about this when we talk about multivariate network layouts, but this is kind of like now a layout by categorical attributes. Okay, let's click on G here. What kind of network structure do we have now? Like, what's the layout that we're using here? Circular, yeah. And if we use the terms from the lecture, it would be a style layout, right? So we don't have a free form arrangement of nodes that we just had earlier, but this is like very strictly laid out. And so what are these two different rings here? Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of the distance, right? We know from this graph here that G is directly connected to all of these people here, and indirectly connected to this group of people here, right? At least according to this attribute, right? So family power is what we're looking at here. Coalitions, I would assume it's slightly different, right? Okay, and the other thing that we like, why do you think again is this here? This kind of like, this is a little bit similar to the query tool that I showed you, right? Where I search and then expand on demand. And here it's kind of like, instead of searching, I just click somebody and I switch to those different people, and I can see like who are they close to down here, and I could click that particular person and so on. Okay, what do you think is the shape and the size here of these nodes? Could be importance, yeah. And the shape is probably the role, right, they have. And so here we can go back to the overview if we wanted to. Okay, and then we have the second chart here. This is institutional power. And so what is the layout here? The tree, and it's again a node link layout, right? And it just uses like some fairly simple tree layout algorithm, I would assume. And we get these kind of like, fancy layout versions here. So it's kind of like, because it's an organization and not a social network, we have these hierarchies in here. And they kind of like all originate from this group of 7 here in the middle. Any other thoughts about this particular chart here? Okay. And then we have this one here, which I find particularly interesting. So, what is shown in this chart? So how quickly people rise through power, right? So we essentially have kind of like here's the top leader, then national chief or deputy, provincial chief or deputy, and then some lower or unknown rank. And so you see that for certain people, they just kind of like climbed that ladder very quickly. So if he's like we will see that he climbs this ladder much quicker than other people that never got quite up as high in the hierarchy as he did, right? So this is actually not a network, right? This is like just attributes about the nodes that we have more information about their history, and it's just showing us more information about those people. So this is more of like a tabular data visualization here, but still about these same nodes. And that also shows you that, it's not always so easy to separate what is tabular, what is networks, and often both of them have to be integrated. So yeah, we're at time. I hope you like this. You can play with it a little bit more and answer some of the questions and submit your activity. We'll see each other on Tuesday to talk about more about networks.